We are back. Video 2. So we're still in the library module, gone through perhaps and selected the images that we are interested in. If you recall, I had started working with some collections. I'm going to look at my shapes collection. I kind of like this one with the hose. I'm going to come in a little closer. Remember, we have our grid and our loop view. I think I'm going to work a little bit more with this one. So I can go ahead and start in our develop module. Now, we talked briefly today about the presets. If I look over here on the left, first of all, you have your navigator, which you can use to navigate around the image. Second, you have your presets. Mine on my computer seems to do it a little faster, right, versus the one at school. When you hover over it, it will, it should go ahead and show you what the change is going to be. If you recall, presets are doing all this good stuff over here on the right. These become preloaded in Lightroom when you get it from Adobe. And it can be some interesting stuff, right? Some of it's a little heavy-handed, but some of it I like. You may try to play with different elements. Like I like that one's kind of cool. For now, I'm not going to use any, so I can show you some more information when you're doing it yourself. But I'm going to go ahead and close presets. We'll talk about snapshots later. We already talked about history, but I will show you that again as we start working with things. Main thing I want you to look over here to the right is I close up basics, as I close up detail. Remember, you can always close these things, right? Basics are what we're going to talk about today. If you look over here at the top, you will see edit, you will see crop, you will see remove, you'll see something called red eye correction, which I do not ever use, and then you'll see masking. So all of these things we'll be talking about. Right now we're going to go with the edits, which is what's already open, and we are going to talk about our basic tools. Auto is what you can select, and it allows Lightroom, the computer within Lightroom, to sort of gauge what it thinks would be the best modifications to your image. So I can try it. If you'll notice, it brought up the exposure a little bit, brought down the highlights. You can see over here. I like it. I would say you come down to the bottom and you see the YY spot. I'm going to select that. This is how my image was brought in. This is how Adobe Lightroom, when I chose auto, thought would look best. I think it looks pretty great. I feel like there still could be some tweaks. And to show you guys a little bit more about the editing aspects, I'm going to go ahead and take out the auto settings that Lightroom did. Now, again, coming over here to history, I can go back to import, right? If I'm in auto settings, I can also do our friend Command Z. So let's go back. So this is how I brought it in. So coming back over to our basic editing panel, remember at the top is the histogram. And we talked about that. We don't want any clipped tones. We don't want any spots that have absolutely no detail in them. You can always select that, right? It was already selected, but select that. Just to show you really quickly, I'm going to come down to exposure and I'm going to push it over. You'll notice in my histogram, I just brought up the exposure a lot. In my histogram, it moved all the way over to the right with the white tones are. The red spots are spots that have absolutely no detail in them. I can do the reverse, right? Now, even just looking at the pictures, you can tell, right, that it's too underexposed, it's way too overexposed. But I'm just showing you this in a dramatic fashion. you can always double click the slider. It will return back to 0. So, looking at my histogram, I noticed that it's pretty good. I don't have quite a black spot, a black point. If you'll notice, it doesn't quite meet the edge. First, overall, what I want to do is bring up the exposure just a tiny bit, because to me it looked a little underexposed. Looking here, I may want to come down to contrast and bring that up. And if you'll watch the histogram, right? Contrast is going to bring a separation in the highlights and the shadows, right? An increased difference between those two places. You can also notice that you have highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Those are represented here in our histogram. You can hover over it, right? It says whites, highlights, exposure, shadows, and blacks. You can tweak those. You can bring down the highlights. You can bring them up. Taking a look at your actual photograph, you can play with that. Remember, coming down here for the before after helps me really to see. One other thing we didn't talk too much about is the white balance. So white balance, again, is having white be truly white, right? You can think of this as color, temperature, and a little bit of tint. I am going to make it a little cooler. That's a little too much cool, right? Or I can make it a little warmer. This is one of the ways you can start playing with the editing process. I'm just going to go ahead and double click it to bring it back to where it was. I'm pretty happy with the color temperature. I can do a similar thing with my tint, right? I'm pretty happy with where it was. So we've got the overall exposure and tonality going on. Presence, texture can help. It helps to, let's say, it helps to a little bit sharpen up actual texture. Clarity helps to increase contrast in midtones, which also helps us to make it look a little bit sharper. Sort of depends on the picture, but that is something that you can play with. You can bring up texture a little bit. You can bring up clarity a little bit. If you do it a whole lot, it's going to start to make the picture look a little crunchy. And if you do it very much in the negative, it looks a little bit like a glamour shot. Right? Did you see what I just did there? So let's go back. This is clarity. I'm going to take it all the way down. You see how it softens everything. So most students want to add a tiny bit there, tiny bit with texture and clarity. Again, kind of depends on the photograph. Dehaze is most helpful. You can play with all these things, right? But dehaze is most helpful in things like smoke, haziness in a landscape. That's really what it was made for. It gives sort of interesting effects that you can play with as well, but I don't really use it a whole lot. Next is vibrance and saturation. Everyone's kind of familiar with saturation, right? This is not a super colorful photograph. You would see the effects of saturation a whole lot more. If you take out all the saturation, it literally is a black and white photograph, right? This is the general rule of thumb. I would say hang back on saturation. Don't do it a whole lot because it is all the colors. Vibrance is helpful, particularly in sort of much more colorful photographs, because it helps to increase the colors that are not as much represented. So saturation is a little more heavy-handed. Again, you can play with these things, and you can see the difference between both of these images. This is how I brought it in. This is what it looks like. Now, the other thing I want you to notice here at the top is the black and white. We can select that, and it becomes black and white. Now, when you're looking down here, you see tone curve, and then you see black and white. Again, anything that the color has originally, I can play with, and I can decrease or I can increase. I'm trying to remember what color my hose is. I think it's a little blue and yellow. There we go. I'm going to see parts of it were yellow. Did you see that? So let's click that back. Watch the hose. I'm going to increase the yellow. So that helps it to pop out. So it's just a more targeted way to work with different tonalities within your black and white photograph. Again, coming over to my history, I can go back multiple steps. You can see all these steps that I took, right? Including go back to before I changed it to a black and white photo. So this is a pretty monochromatic image. I kind of like it both ways. Looks a little more like a snake when it's black and white, so I may keep it with that. The other elements, again, that is just the basics panel here, right? You can close that up or leave it open, up to you. That's the black and white that we talked about. We're not going to get into color grading yet. Lens correction, if you were using an actual 35 millimeter camera, this helps a little bit more. But you can remove some aspects of whatever lens that you're using when you shot it, some irregularities. So if you watch my photograph and I select enable profile corrections, you'll see that it helps to correct whatever the issues had with the lens. You'll see the lens, Apple, iPhone, etc., etc. You can play with the distortion a little bit. You can play with vignetting. Vignetting is, oh, it doesn't have any. So for my particular lens, I can't play with the vignetting. But if you guys are using the 35 millimeters, it will allow you to do that. So other elements that we'll talk about here, I'm going to go ahead and close it up, is detail. Detail is basically has to do with sharpening. I would say sharpen it just a little bit. You don't have to worry about the radius, etc. at this point. Just sharpen it up a bit, not too much, because it is going to look crunchy. This is a newer aspect of Lightroom, this denoise. We'll talk about that later. I don't really want that for my image here. So that will be that for now. I want you to come down. I want you to notice you've come down here. You can hit reset. That resets everything that I just did. I'm not going to do that. Again, you can come over to history and you can see all the steps you took, as well as, go back a couple steps if you want to. I can go here down at the bottom and I can select the loop view to see my beautiful picture. I'm going to go back to library. I am going to go back to grid view, and I want you to notice I didn't create a virtual copy for it, right? I can do that now. I can go up to photo and create a virtual copy. There's a shortcut always for everything, right? So I can do a different editing process to that one. And that is it for video 2.